$55. That's what Emily Carter spent at the feed store that spring, and it wasn't on the things her neighbors expected. Not fertilizer, not feed supplements, not another round of drought-resistant seed for the exhausted pasture grass. She spent it on sunflower seeds, ordinary packets pulled off a rack near the checkout counter, and she used every last one of them lining the edges of her cattle pastures. Her neighbors watched from the road, the same way they always watched Emily's experiments, with a mixture of amusement and quiet judgment. One old rancher shook his head and told his wife it was the kind of thing you did when you'd given up on real solutions. Another suggested, not unkindly, that the money would have been better spent on one more round of hay before winter. Months later, a university vehicle pulled down that same gravel road, carrying agricultural researchers who had driven 300 miles to see Emily's farm in person. One of them stood at the pasture fence, looking out at cattle grazing calmly beside a border of tall, golden sunflowers, and said quietly, "We've never seen pasture behavior like this." The most important thing growing on Emily's farm wasn't the sunflowers. It was something no one had noticed until the cattle stopped behaving the way cattle were supposed to. If you enjoy real farming stories, agricultural innovations, and unbelievable rural success stories, subscribe to the channel, because every week we uncover farm discoveries that are changing agriculture across America. To understand how $55 in seed packets ended up drawing researchers across 3 states, you have to understand what Emily Carter's farm looked like before any of this began. She was 42 years old, and she'd inherited the cattle operation from her father 2 years earlier, after his death left her holding a business that had been quietly struggling for the better part of a decade. Drought had settled over the region in a way that felt less like weather and more like a slow, permanent shift. Pastures that used to green up reliably by May now stayed brown and brittle well into summer. Feed costs climbed every season while cattle prices refused to keep pace, squeezing a margin that had already been thin under her father's management. Emily made the difficult calculations every rancher in that county was making. Stressed cattle needed more supplemental feed to maintain their weight, which cost more money she didn't have. Degraded soil held less water during the rare rains that did come, which meant pastures recovered slower and thinner every year, which meant less grazing capacity, which meant more feed costs all over again. It was a cycle that ate away at the farm from every direction at once, and neighbors who meant well kept suggesting the same solution. Sell part of the herd, reduce the pressure, cut her losses before the debt outpaced the land's value entirely. Emily listened to all of it. Then she kept looking for another way, because selling off pieces of her father's herd felt like giving up on something she wasn't ready to let go of yet. The sunflower idea didn't arrive as a grand plan. It arrived almost by accident, the way most unconventional ideas do, while Emily was reading through old agricultural extension newsletters looking for anything that might help with soil recovery on a budget she could actually afford. A short article mentioned flowering borders being used on some experimental farms to support pollinator populations, and mentioned, almost as an aside, that certain flowering plants could improve soil structure along field edges over time. It wasn't a detailed study. It wasn't even really about cattle operations at all. But something about it stuck with Emily, and she found herself thinking about the bare, eroding edges of her own pastures, the places where topsoil washed away fastest during the rare downpours, where nothing much grew except patchy weeds. Sunflowers were cheap, drought-tolerant, and famous for their deep taproots, capable of reaching further into dry soil than the shallow-rooted pasture grass around them. $55 bought enough seed to line her water areas, her fence rows, and the eroding edges near her cattle pastures. It was a small enough gamble that even if it failed completely, she wouldn't lose much beyond a wasted afternoon of planting. Her brother-in-law asked her directly at a family dinner not long after whether she'd lost her mind spending money on flowers when the herd needed real investment. Emily didn't have a confident answer for him that night. She just said she wanted to see what happened and left it there. Neighbors driving past that spring saw the same thing her brother-in-law had seen a circumflex euros, a rancher under financial pressure, planting flowers along a cattle pasture instead of doing anything that looked like real farming. The laughter wasn't cruel mostly. It was the tired, familiar kind reserved for someone everyone assumed was about to learn a hard lesson. The first changes were small enough that Emily almost missed them. By midsummer, bees had shown up in numbers she hadn't seen on the property in years, moving steadily between the sunflower rows from morning until dusk. Butterflies followed soon after, drifting along the fence lines in a way that made the pastures feel different somehow, more alive than the brown, quiet landscape she'd grown used to. Bird activity increased too, small flocks working the flowering borders for insects, filling the mornings with sound the farm hadn't carried in a long while. What surprised Emily more than the insects and birds was what happened to the ground itself. The soil near the sunflower borders, the same eroding edges that used to wash out during hard rain, began holding together noticeably better. Erosion along those strips slowed. Grass growing near the flowering borders came in thicker and greener than grass in the open pasture beyond, even during a summer that offered no more rainfall than the year before. And then there was the cattle behavior, the detail that eventually pulled researchers 300 miles down a gravel road. Emily started noticing that her herd spent more time grazing calmly near the sunflower-lined sections of pasture, moving less, showing fewer signs of the heat stress and restlessness that usually marked a dry summer. It wasn't dramatic at first. It was the kind of thing only someone who watched her cattle every single day would notice at all. But Emily watched her cattle every single day, and she started writing it down. Better forage growth near the flowering zones, improved water retention after rain, calmer, steadier grazing patterns. She didn't have a scientific explanation for any of it yet. She just had a growing stack of handwritten notes and a stubborn refusal to dismiss what she was seeing with her own eyes. Visiting ranchers noticed it too, eventually. The way word travels through a farming community once curiosity outweighs skepticism. A rancher from 2 counties over, stopping by to look at a bull Emily had for sale, spent longer than expected standing at the fence line, staring at the difference between the pasture near the sunflowers and the pasture further out. Emily's local county extension agent, a woman named Carol who'd known Emily's father for decades, took a genuine interest once Emily finally worked up the nerve to show her the notes she'd been keeping. Carol walked the property with her, took a few informal soil samples, and admitted she'd never seen documentation quite like it from a working cattle operation. She encouraged Emily to keep detailed records, and began mentioning the farm, cautiously at first, in conversations with contacts at the state university's agricultural department. Photographs and pasture measurements made their way to a research team specializing in grazing ecology and pasture resilience. What began as a mildly interesting anecdote about a rancher planting sunflowers for pollinators started to look, on paper, like something considerably more complex. Enough interest built up over a few months that a small research team decided the farm was worth seeing in person and made the 300-mile drive out to Emily's gate. What happened next surprised everyone, including the researchers themselves. The team arrived expecting a simple pollinator story, the kind that made for a pleasant afternoon and a short report about bee activity on flowering field margins. What they found instead was a layered ecological interaction that took them the better part of 2 full days to properly document. They took soil samples along transects running from the sunflower borders out into the open pasture, comparing organic matter content, water infiltration rates, and microbial activity at each distance. They conducted plant diversity surveys, cataloging species that had re-established themselves near the flowering strips. They set up simple insect monitoring traps, recording not just pollinators but predator insects, the kind that fed on pasture pests that normally stressed both plants and grazing cattle. They measured soil moisture at different depths after a light rain, tracking how quickly water moved into the ground near the sunflower roots compared to the open grass beyond. They even examined root structures directly, cutting soil profiles to see how far the sunflower taproots extended compared to the shallow root mats of the surrounding pasture grass. The explanation, once the researchers pieced it together, turned out to be more interesting than any single cause Emily could have guessed on her own. The sunflower's deep taproots were creating channels in the soil that allowed water to infiltrate far more efficiently than it could through compacted, shallow-rooted grassland alone, meaning more of each rainfall actually stayed in the ground instead of running off. That improved moisture, in turn, supported stronger soil microbial activity, the kind of underground biological engine responsible for breaking down organic matter and cycling nutrients back into a form plants could use. Increased pollinator activity supported not just the sunflowers but nearby forage plants that depended on the same insects, boosting seed production and plant diversity across the pasture edges over time. The predator insects drawn in by the flowering borders were quietly reducing populations of pests that would otherwise stress the grass, and indirectly, the cattle grazing it. And the sunflowers themselves, tall and dense along the fence lines, were providing something researchers hadn't initially considered at all: a microclimate effect, buffering wind and offering partial shade that reduced heat stress on both the nearby forage and the cattle grazing close to it. Less stressed grass grew back thicker after grazing. Less stressed cattle spent more time calmly eating and less time standing restlessly in the heat, which meant they were converting available forage into weight gain more efficiently than the herds on neighboring, unshaded pastures. None of it was any single dramatic discovery. It was biodiversity, quietly compounding advantage after advantage, until a $55 experiment had reshaped the ecological function of an entire section of working cattle pasture. But the most important discovery came months later, once the researchers had gone home, and Emily had time to add up what all of it actually meant for the farm itself. Feed costs, which had climbed relentlessly for years, finally began to level off as pasture productivity near the flowering borders improved. The herd's overall condition improved alongside it, cattle spending their energy grazing efficiently instead of packing restlessly through stressed, overheated pasture. The farm, which had felt like it was slowly slipping away from her for 2 straight years, started to feel stable again for the first time since her father's death. Emily never became wealthy from sunflowers. That was never really the point, and she'd be the first to say so. What she gained instead was something steadier and, to her, considerably more valuable: a working farm that had found its footing again, built not on a single dramatic breakthrough, but on paying close attention to details everyone else had been too busy or too skeptical to notice. Neighbors who'd laughed that first spring started planting flowering borders of their own along their pasture edges the following year, some out of genuine curiosity, others simply unwilling to be the only rancher in the county not trying it. The university research team asked permission to use Emily's farm as an ongoing demonstration site, bringing student groups out periodically to see, firsthand, what a $55 experiment had grown into. Her father's farm, the one everyone had quietly assumed might not survive another difficult season, remained fully in the family, standing on ground healthier than it had been in years. At sunset one evening that following autumn, Emily walked the fence line where it had all started, sunflowers still standing tall and gold against the darkening sky, cattle grazing peacefully in the pasture beyond them. She thought about her father, about the farm he'd handed her without much warning, and about how close she'd come to believing the only solution left was to sell off pieces of everything he'd built. Sometimes the smallest investment on a farm creates the biggest change, because nature notices what people overlook. Have you ever seen flowers improve a farm, pasture, or garden in a way that surprised you? Share your experience in the comments. And if you believe America's best farming ideas often come from ordinary farmers willing to try something different, subscribe for more incredible agricultural stories.